All right, let's kick things off. So this is the LIP call number 4, and let's just jump straight into the agenda. So the first section of the agenda is dedicated to LIP candidates. So each LIP candidate has a champion, and in this week, for this week's call, I also just made note of the current champion for each of the candidates, just so that we're all aware. And typically the responsibility of the champion is to, if they're in attendance on the call, their responsibility is to take us through the latest status of that LIP. If they have any asks from a feedback standpoint or from a logistics standpoint, they can make those asks on that call. And we can use this call as a forum to just help push forward that LIP. And at the end of the day, it's up to the champion to continue pushing for that LIP. And this is just a forum to help give them feedback or to help them along in that process. So first up is the InflationChange parameter update. And this is something that was originally created by Victor. Victor, who's on the call, do you want to give an update on where this LIP is at to the rest of the people on this call?
Yeah, I would love to. So first off, I got a lot of amazing feedback from different funds, token holders, Lightbeer team members, community members, other infrastructure providers. So folks from my own team. So thank you everybody for providing that. Try to incorporate it as best as I can, answer the comments in the thread as best as possible. There were some great ideas thrown out, so great discussion. The biggest change that was made is I received excellent feedback that it makes sense to have these, to split this proposal in two because of the technical change that it requires to how the inflation is actually calculated to enable greater decimal precision. And so I worked with Yandin to split the original lip 34 up. And so now it's like the lip 34 is only to update the inflation rate, inflation change parameter. And then lip 40 that Yandin submitted is the actual technical implementation of it that changes the Minter contract to just enable a greater degree of precision in the decimal places. So these are bundled together under lip 35 and very similar to the governance lip, which I believe was lip 19. The bundle will be voted on simultaneously. And so like both of these lips have to be approved or neither one of them will be. And so it'll only be one vote. But the nice advantage of this is that there's like this, a little bit of a separation of concerns and that people can have like directed conversation around, one, the technical implementation in one lip versus, the actual, merits of whether or not we want to change the parameter in the other lip. Also saying lip this many times is fascinating.
Does that mean that an inflation change for an amount that doesn't require changes to the precision is off the table?
I am not submitting that proposal. If somebody else would like to submit another proposal that would do that, then they are welcome to.
So the proposal is just for the value you propose, and there's like, that's the only value possible for this proposal, right?
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
I was gonna say, like, one of the nice things about separating them out is that the work Yandin did is really good. And so even if this proposal as a bundle does not pass, the work is still like the right work. And so if in the future we decide to, go down this path or like make any other kind of like changes, it's nice because the work there will still like be relevant and useful. So we can resubmit that lip in the future if we need to.
Yeah, generally, I think the idea of splitting up the implementation concerns from the parameter update concerns was a good move. Primarily just because like it's a little easier to reason about each of them individually. So we know that one is necessary for the other, but the inflation change parameter discussion can be a purely, I guess, like more economic oriented discussion, and any discussion around like the implementation and technical intricacies can be diverted to a separate discussion thread. So while they might end up, while they'll likely be voted on together, I feel like just from a clarity standpoint for discussion, they make sense to me.
Yeah, and then from a process perspective, I'm hoping that, you know, if there's any further comment, you know, happy to chat here. Also happy to chat in the thread so that we can have like a record of it, and you know, we can leave responses. My goal is to continue taking comment, but also like move the proposal to last call today, and so that'll put it on track. And in 10 days time, actually have it transition to a poll and then vote on it.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, so you mentioned that outside of the LIP thread, you had a lot of good discussions with other LivePeer community members, and obviously not all of that might be reflected either in Discord or in the discussion thread. I'm curious if in those conversations, the feedback that you got was mainly positive and supportive, or if you feel like that there was any good points made by any of those people about concerns that kind of like made you think a little more about this proposal.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things. Something that I thought a lot about is like, you know, how do we make decisions as a community around economics, and around incentive models in general. I think that that's something that I think a lot about, and there's a lot of examples of, you know, folks changing the incentive models that have, you know, ultimately driven a lot more adoption, such as like synthetics, and certain other examples. And so I think like having a framework in which to reason about it as a community is like incredibly important. And one of the things that made me think about is that like, you know, at which point is a framework needed, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Um, and so I responded to something that Nick said, kind of like touching upon that, where my stance is that I feel comfortable, you know, with more of a direction, right, or more of a guidance rather than a more explicit framework at this point in the protocol. But I also like recognize the importance of having frameworks, of having things that, you know, that we as a community find important. And so I do think that over time, potentially over the next like year or two, it would be good to, you know, consolidate our thoughts, and you know, definitely before making any kind of like bigger overhaul, that it's important that we actually like write down what is important to us, other than like, we want to encourage, you know, usage. Like, yes, that is the most important one, but like, you know, what are you willing to do or not willing to do? Like how drastic of changes are you willing to make? You know, what is the timing of those changes? And so, yeah, like, you know, I think that that really stuck with me. And so, before, you know, if we do decide to do any kind of like larger scale change in the future, like I would want to have a conversation around, you know, what do we find important as a community, and how are we going to reason about it even before we get to the poll. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is I really appreciated all of the alternative proposals that people came up with, such as, you know, changing the target staking rate, or, you know, tying it to transcoding, or a bunch of other ones. It helped me gain, one, really consider those, and have those conversations, but then also out of that, feel more comfortable with my recommendation. Just because, like, how should I put it? I think that what it really came down to is how much of a band-aid change do you want to make versus how much of a like bigger bet do you want to make. And that was like, you know, aside from the, you know, the pros and cons of each proposal, that was like one of the kind of like unifying themes across different considerations. And so, yeah, like having those conversations definitely helped me think about it a little bit clearer. And maybe the last thing that came out to me is, and this is something that Kyle talked about, where he was like, how can we actually, how can we do more? Like, are we doing enough? And I think that comment kind of like stuck with me from the perspective of, the synthetics example that I brought on earlier, or other like, yield farming type situations that you have now, or other like token distribution mechanisms. I think live peer really uh, was very pioneering in the Merkle mine. An interesting thing there is that typically we think of a token distribution mechanism or incentive mechanism as happening a singular time, like, oftentimes sometime in the beginning of a protocol's lifespan. But in seeing those comments, it made me kind of think, like, does that have to necessarily be true, right? Does it mean that there can't be another attempt at a distribution mechanism or incentive mechanism or some other kind of like program to incentivize useful work? And I think that I typically think of I previously only thought of them as a one-time event, and now I'm kind of like, okay, if you posit in your mind that it is not it does not have to be a one-time event, and it can be a two-time event or even a three-time event potentially, right? Like, what does that second event actually look like? And I don't have an answer there or a recommendation, but I think that it's important to realize that it is an option, and it is something that we can, that we can think about as a community, and see if there's a path forward there.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you covered a lot of really interesting points. I guess the main one that I wanted to touch on myself was that um, your point about like the alternative proposals that other people have come up with. I guess my perception thus far has been, I feel like when you created your original proposal, the reason that you made it so tightly scoped was because it was very singularly focused on this goal of not having the inflation rewards run out within the next 6 to 8 months. And I guess from my perception or my point of view, a lot of the alternate proposals also seek to do that. But in addition to that, they try to achieve some other separate goal. So whether it be like changing the target participation rate, or even changing the way that the inflation rewards are distributed based upon a more accurate gauge of work on the network. I think in both cases, like, they would simultaneously try to address this issue that you're trying to address with this proposal, but they also try to solve other problems as well. And I guess the thing that I would be wary about is, like, if the feeling is that this goal of addressing the inflation rewards issue in the next 6 to 8 months is like the top priority thing, then it might be a little dangerous to also simultaneously solve other things within the same proposal without taking the proper time to figure out if like those problems are actually solved. And then the reason why someone would just create a more tightly scoped proposal is because, yes, solving all those problems eventually are important as well. But if the top priority is just making sure inflationary rewards don't run out, then it might make sense to keep it as tightly scoped as possible. So that's kind of been my perception on the entire thing, where I certainly see value in the alternate proposals, but the risk for them is that I think they try to tackle much larger problems in addition to the inflation rewards running out, which makes it a lot harder for them to be like the candidates for how to solve this inflation reward problem in the next 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that's a really good way. That's a really good way of putting it. I think I've been also thinking about it in this way, but maybe not as lucidly as you have just put it. So thank you. Yeah, I think, and I apologize if I'm like a little bit redundant now, but I do think that there's a number of other things that we should and do want to change about life here, right? Like I do agree with a lot of the proposals in that the target staking rate is like not the right one, and it's like not the one that we're you know, you know, it's not the rate that we're seeing on any other network or on this one. And so like it does need an update of some sort. And we do want to incentivize more like transcoding rather than like people that aren't doing anything. Like there's a lot of things that we want to do. I totally agree with them too, which is what, and I also want to solve those problems, which is what sometimes like, I recognize it. I recognize that desire, but I also, as you mentioned, I do think that, economic systems are incredibly complex, and even if you change what is like otherwise like maybe not, it's only like a single parameter, even only like the participation rate. I think that by trying to address broader problems with not as broad of a solution, it just makes it a little bit harder to, as you commented, like reason about all the possible, optionality that you have, and how much will this change actually solve the broader problem that you're talking about, rather than like a pretty, you know like a scalpel like singular small change. So yeah, I think it's a great comment. I don't have a great answer, but I definitely agree with you.
Cool. Yeah, I think the point that you brought up just kind of made me think a little bit about that, so felt like expressing it. But anyone else on the call have any reactions to some of Victor's comments right now? If not, we can probably move on and have the rest of the discussion happen on GitHub.
I think everything's great. I think it would be great to have that kind of written out in GitHub so that anyone who's joining the conversation late, like I see Chris Marinas like made a comment 30 minutes ago and he's like asking this a completely new thing, right? Like it'd be good to have that perspective so that we kind of focus the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe what I'll do, I'll try to do this. Ideally sometime today, is there's like answers that came out of the discussion, but if you just read the top, like you won't get them unless you're committed to reading the whole thing, and it's getting long at this point. and so maybe like I have my like argument and counter argument. Maybe I'll just add a couple of sections there to just like provide a little bit more commentary.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, kind of a concise summary of takeaways at this point, so that like anyone can scroll to like your latest comment and be like, well, there's a lot more depth in the comments above, but this gives me a snapshot of where we're currently at. Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
And I think if the intent is to move the LIP into last call soon, then I think that could be like a good thing to complement that. So moving into last call, simultaneously presenting like the current snapshot. And then once the last call period kicks off, anyone can visit that snapshot and kind of, yeah, it's the last call for comments, so they can just base it off of the snapshot that you provide.
Yeah. And it's also good for me. I'm taking a vacation starting August 3rd. And so I'm going to be like, not as active, because I'll be like in like Glacier National Park. So I'm hoping to get to answer as many things as I can. I'm upfront.
Cool. So I think the to-dos here seem like following up in the discussion thread, providing a snapshot of the conversation up to date, and then, yeah, probably moving to last call soon thereafter. Yeah, anything else on your mind, Victor, that would be helpful for us to discuss on this call before we move on to the next topic?
No, I don't think so.
All right, great, sounds good. Let's jump forward to the next candidate then. So the next candidate is LIP 25. This is the extensible governance contract. And this is something that Nico has been championing. And I think the basic gist is that it would be a governance contract that does not yet hand off control to, let's say, an on-chain voting system, but it does implement restrictions on how updates can take place. So a time delay or a time lock, if you will, and also enables batching together multiple updates so that if you have to update multiple contracts, you can do that more easily. So Nico, do you want to take us through where this LIP is currently at today?
Yeah, thanks for the great summary. So there's been a few changes since the last LIP call. So we discussed about like a social enforceable delay. So there's no delay parameter that needs to be set at like the genesis of this contract. It's just like socially enforced that whenever LivePeer Inc. wants to execute an update, that it needs to be staged with like a delay that is socially agreed upon. That allows LivePeer Inc. to still do bug fixes and pause the protocol in case user funds would be at risk in the case of like a vulnerability detection. And like there are two separate pods to do this, and like I said before, it's enforced by social convention. There is an implementation out for this LIP, which has been under like a first iteration of review. There are like a small open discussion points there. And the other major thing is like looking into whether we want to use a new Solidity compiler version specifically for this contract that is like newer than the compiler version for the other contracts of the LivePeer protocol. I don't feel like this is a blocker for moving this LIP forward. So I think we can actually move this into last call this week and then have a vote on it. And then we should be able to move it forward.
Cool. So you think that the current state of the review process is that it's almost done with the first pass and most of the details are in place such that we can move into last call and any additional changes can happen. Any additional smaller changes can happen in the last call period because the major things have been decided upon.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Unless, of course, like community members don't feel comfortable with like the open pending changes for when it gets to voting, but that's like their personal opinion on the matter, I guess. So yeah, I feel like we can move to last call.
Great. Anyone on the call have any questions or comments for Nico?
No, nothing here.
One comment that I have is that depending on timing, depending on timing, if this LIP were to be voted on and if it were to be accepted and deployed on mainnet, it would likely make the deployment of other LIPs easier. So the one in particular that I'm thinking about is the InflationChange parameter update LIP. So in that umbrella LIP, it bundles LIP 40, which describes the precision update in the Minter contract. And I made a note in the description of that LIP that the deployment process is multi-step. So it involves, I believe, at least 2 separate transactions, maybe 3. And that's okay. Like we're able to do that if that LIP were to be accepted. But just noting that if this LIP were to be accepted and deployed first, then instead of doing 3 separate transactions, it would be a single transaction, which just makes the process easier. So I think that might be something that I don't think that we need to like say one depends on the other, but I think that could be something worth keeping in the back of people's minds as this LIP continues through the process, because if the timing works out, then that would be nice if they're both accepted.
Yeah, I guess my comment on that would be also regarding timing, whether we want to audit both LIPs, and it might be just interesting to like throw that in one bulk and then have that audited, or do that separately and then we can like have that separate track. So yeah, something to consider, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I guess my quick thought on the audit, for the InflationChange parameter LIP, my current thought is that it's so small in scope that I personally would be comfortable not having like a third-party security review for that. And then for the governance contract LIP, I feel less great about it, but I also feel okay about not having a security review for this one, given that it's also pretty small in scope. The one that I'm the most uncertain about is LIP 36, which we'll get to. And that one contains a much more substantial amount of changes. So yeah, that's currently where I'm at. And yeah, probably need to think about it a little more. I don't know if anyone else on the call has immediate thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I have a similar feeling, but I was just wondering, like, if we have LIP 36 and we do an audit for that, we might just as well throw in the governance contract into the scope and maybe the Minter precision update as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe we should, as we make progress on each of these LIPs, we should kind of take count of where they are all at from a timing perspective, and then see if that could make sense.
Mm-hmm. What does, like, just as an observation, it might make sense to push the governance contract forward first, just so that the subsequent LIPs, that the community has more certainty over the upgrade path for them, because LIP 25, the governance contract would already be deployed, and thus those additional changes would be subject to a time delay. That's like the additional thought I had there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. Like looping back to the inflation change parameter update, like if the governance contract were to be accepted and deployed first, when we get to the inflation change parameter update, if that is accepted, that would be substantially easier and also provides more transparency. Cool. I guess if no one else has any thoughts on this at the moment, I feel like this is worthwhile. I feel like the takeaways are we should assess the timing of each of the current LIPs that we have outstanding, and then based upon that, consider whether it would make sense to do a batch audit for all of them versus having the governance contract be rolled forward first to enable easier updates for the other LIPs if they're accepted. And yeah, we can catch up about this offline and maybe sync up about it on the next LIP call. How does that sound to everyone?
Sounds good to me. The one thing I would add is that where I differ in opinion, I guess, is that I think we should have an audit for the governance contract, even though the change or like the implementation is fairly small and the change itself is not that big. Like it does have a big potential effect. So just having like third-party eyes on that would be helpful also for other stakeholders of the LifePeer protocol.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And yeah, so let's kind of regroup outside of this call and then in the next call. And I think maybe we can say for the next call, we can make a formal decision on or we can make a formal decision about the requirement of an audit for at least one or multiple of the current outstanding LIPs.
Sounds good.
Cool. Anything else about LIP 25 anyone wants to bring up?
I guess I want to ask if there's like like Nico or Yandan have any thoughts around like when we should be expecting this to be voted on, like, but considering that there is an audit process.
So I think when it is voted on, I think the earliest that it could be voted on is after the LIP moves through the last call process. And then depending on the decision on whether to do an audit or not, that could push the time of the vote start to later. Presumably, if the decision is made to have an audit, it should be completed before the vote actually takes place so that people have access to that information. So yeah, I'd say minimum the earliest it could be is after the last call period finishes. So if the last call period starts, let's say at the end of this week, then 10 days from then. But it could be a little longer if we schedule an audit to take place before the vote starts.
Right.
There's also the perspective we could take that we discussed during last LIP call as well regarding whether an implementation should be finished. Like we could potentially do a vote without an audit. If the community doesn't feel comfortable moving the poll forward without an audit, it will likely not pass, and we would have to audit it first and then redo the poll, I guess, and find more willingness to go forward with that LIP with the community. So it could also be like just a part of the social LIP process itself, whether we require an audit or not. But I do think we should, if we say in the proposal we are going to audit for the LIP, then it should at least happen before it's implemented. But whether that should happen before or after a vote is like, I think, up to the community and their risk appetite for the upgrade.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think my personal preference would be if an audit is scheduled, that it takes place before the vote happens. I feel like that's like useful information that like strengthens the proposal's ability to have success during the vote. That's my current initial thought, but yeah, I'm open to hearing other arguments for or against as well.
What if we receive a code upgrade from someone outside of the LivePeer core team? We can't really expect them to audit that by themselves, right? We would have to do that for them. And how would you see that playing out in the LIP process then?
How would you see that playing out in the LIP?
For us, it would only be worth doing an audit on such a proposal if it has enough support, so that we don't really have to audit every proposal that comes through. And for us to know that, we would have to either get a signal based on a poll, or we would have to run a poll and use that result as the, let's say, governance decision.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that the choice, like the requirement of an audit, I don't think, kind of as you mentioned, the audit needs to be like an explicitly enforced part of the LIP process. It's more so a useful tool to improve the likelihood of an LIP being accepted, because I think while at the moment there's still room for an LIP implementation to be modified in between it being accepted and it being deployed, the ultimate end state with an on-chain binding voting system likely will not have as much room for that, in that like once a proposal is accepted, it automatically gets staged and scheduled for deployment, barring like a cancellation that happens somehow, if that's a feature. So yeah, I don't think the audit needs to be explicitly required in the LIP process, but it just seems that if someone, whether it's members of the LivePeer Inc. company or third-party community members, if they're submitting an LIP and it involves a highly technical implementation, it might benefit them a lot to like find a way to provide a security review on that implementation, and whether those resources come from the company or the resources are pulled together, that's flexible. So yeah, that's my initial take.
Yeah, I guess that sounds reasonable as well. Although I guess there's like a difference here between when we move to like a binding voting system versus the current situation. But
yeah, totally. Yeah, I think what I was trying to highlight was that while there is that breathing room right now in between the time of acceptance and deployment, there's a good chance that that breathing room wouldn't exist in the future. Cool. So as we mentioned, I think a lot of good discussion about the requirement of an audit particularly for the LIPs that we've discussed thus far, but generally for other LIPs in the future. I think the to-dos for this group is reconvene the next LIP call, and then a decision can be made specifically about the LIPs that are currently up for discussion. All right, let's move on to the last topic then. So that's, or last candidate topic, which is LIP 36. This is titled Cumulative Earnings Claiming, and this was, a draft was created for this last week, and what the proposal describes is a new algorithm for claiming your earnings on the network. So that involves staking rewards, but also involves fees. And the main problem it tries to solve is that the current algorithm is quite expensive to execute using the current smart contract implementation. And the proposal describes an updated algorithm that seeks to drastically reduce the end transaction cost of claiming one's earnings. So highly relevant for token holders generally, but also very relevant for orchestrators, given that they need to be able to claim their earnings in order to access the rewards and fees, either to sell in order to fund their operations or for further investment in their operation. So a draft was created last week, and since then, we've started an implementation for the spec. And I think it's, as the implementation process has continued, I think have found issues with the spec, and certain things in the spec need to be updated. And Nico has been the main person working on the implementation. So Nico, do you think that there's anything worth sharing about the implementation and its current status for the rest of the group?
Well, we did indeed find some, we're taking like a bit of a test-driven development approach here, because we already had some prior test cases and we want to make sure those still check out. So that's mainly how we discovered some of the edge cases and the bugs. So yeah, we need to update the spec for that, so that everyone has an up-to-date view for that. Other than that, I feel like we are making good progress here. So I hope to finish an implementation and then have it ready for review. And then I think we should be able to like perhaps move this, or at least discuss moving this to last call during the next LIP call.
Right. So I guess relative to the other LIPs, it's probably fair to say that this one is a little farther behind, also because the scope is substantially larger than the other ones. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, that's indeed right. I also think like the changes itself take a little bit more consideration than the other LIPs, just because it has such an impact on the fees and the reward earnings. And if we want to make sure there's no errors in that, in the new calculation approach, of course, so that people don't miss out on their rewards.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's a little, it's farther behind relative to the other two LIPs that we discussed, and that's okay. So I think the earliest that we would consider moving this into last call is probably, I don't think it needs to be perfectly aligned with the next LIP call, but I think our expectation is that in that time frame is probably a better time for moving this into last call relative to the other LIPs, where I think we said that we want to move them into last call probably sometime this week.
Yeah, perhaps I should have phrased that better and said that the implementation should at least be finished by the next LIP call. Definitely, well, it should definitely be finished before the next LIP call.
Okay, great. And yeah, I think this is, yeah, this will be an important, this feels like, relative to the other two LIPs, probably a pretty uncontroversial change, given that it's seems like an absolute positive for everyone on the network. So yeah, I feel like we probably don't need to discuss as much about like dealing with like community feedback. Just need to make sure that like everything is transparent and accessible to everyone. But in contrast with like the inflation change parameter update, there's probably less of a community feedback loop there.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. All right, so to-dos here are, we're working on completing the implementation, and then once we get to that point, we can talk about the next steps for moving it into last call. Anyone have any comments or questions either for me about the LIP or for Nico, given that he's been working on the implementation?
No, nothing.
All right, cool. So that wraps up the LIP candidate section of the call. The next section of the call before the very end is the open discussion period, is a topic about the LIP process that was briefly discussed at the end of last call, but some people had to run off. So there was a much smaller group that talked maybe for like 5 minutes about this topic. So this was added to this week's agenda, again, in case anyone wants to follow up on this. And this is about the requiring an implementation at a particular stage of the LIP process, and if so, what stage it should be required in. And just to share with everybody, in that small discussion at the end of last time's call, I think it was Doug that voiced his thoughts on this and mentioned that feels like it doesn't need to be explicitly required in the LIP process, but it should be thought of as a tool for the proposer in order to maximize their chances of their proposal being accepted. So it's not explicitly required for the LIP to have an implementation going into the voting period, but just know that from a community perspective, an implementation is going to increase the likelihood that people are going to react favorably to that proposal. And then also keep in mind that at the moment, in the current social conventions around the LIP process and the voting period, LIPs that involve technical changes wouldn't be executed, even if they're accepted, if there is no implementation. So that's, I think, the one hard requirement at the very end of the process. But besides that, I think the thought was that it is a tool for the proposer, and it's up to the proposer when to introduce it. So yeah, that was like the brief topic. That was the brief discussion that we had at the end of the last call. But wanted to take the opportunity to see if anyone else on this call has opinions about this matter or specific reactions to that thought that I just summarized from last call.
No, I mainly agree with the thoughts there. The one thing I would add is that I think we should at least establish the convention that an implementation should be finished before moving the LIP to a vote, because once we have a binding voting system, let's say we have a contract upgrade, the bytecode itself would be subject to the vote. So I think we should at least have it as a convention to have it ready, but it's not an explicit requirement.
Right. Yeah, I think it's good to have that as a convention. What's interesting is that, like, thinking forward to that on-chain voting system, if the bytecode is provided, someone in theory could provide a bytecode of 0, right? And that's like the proposed changes that go forth. But presumably anyone that looks at that will just see that as complete and utter nonsense. So similarly, right now, someone could put forward an LIP without an implementation, but it would be the equivalent of like creating that on-chain proposal with a bytecode of 0. And it's really on like the community to reject that because it makes no sense. So yeah, that was like my brief reaction. But yeah, I agree with you that I do think it should be a convention that we, most people should strive towards.
One of the things that we've done in the Cosmos Hub is to have 2 steps. So have an overview just to see if people agree with what the proposed changes are in like a human language form, and then a final vote on whether or not the implementation is acceptable and reflects what was voted on in the first vote.
Right. So this is, I guess, like the first stage is kind of like a straw poll, and just like getting people's thoughts on the idea, like a sentiment poll, as we talked about previously. Is that accurate?
Maybe it's a bit stronger. Like, I guess the idea is that it would be whether or not we should proceed in that direction to write an implementation, and like these are the things that we plan to change. And so it is like it's the values of the community, like what you value or not. And then the final one is just like, is this code done well, and does this code do what we wanted from the first vote? So the first vote is kind of like powerful in a value sense, and the second one is powerful in a code sense.
I see. Does the first vote from a proposal standpoint work the same way as the second vote? Like there's a cost attached to it and it functions virtually the same, or are there major differences?
Yeah, it's a deposit amount. And now the way things work is that if quorum is met and if the vote isn't vetoed, then the deposit's returned.
Right. So I guess right now what we could do is if we introduced a similar process, we have the tools available to do that. Likely we'll need to make some application updates. But I guess like the core difference is that right now we burn the deposit as opposed to in Cosmos where you actually have it returned to you, and maybe burning the deposit at that, if we have a two-stage process, maybe burning the deposit is too onerous for a lot of people, and maybe it would be beneficial to consider something like what Cosmos does with returning the deposit. So that's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, definitely, because there's a lot of work involved in, like, as probably Victor can attest to, there's a lot of work involved in this process. And so there's enough friction. There's like adding more friction, like also the cost of tokens might be discouraging. So it's something worth considering, I think.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think like, Victor, if we had this two-step process, if we already had this two-step process, but the first step required burning a deposit, do you think you still would have moved forward with like your work on this proposal, or do you think that would have been like a deal breaker for you?
It definitely wouldn't have been a deal breaker. I'm just not convinced that it adds a lot of value to burn the deposit.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know who that benefits. Like ideally, the person doing the work should not have to also like pay money to do the work. You know, like I'm paying with my time. And so I you know, I think in an ideal state the deposit should always be returned. And I also think like the process is kind of like lengthy as it is, or maybe it feels that way to me just like doing it first time. Like I don't have a lot of experience with governance, and so yeah, I would say like in adding more friction or monetary payment, like we should be really intentional about what explicit value it adds to the experience.
Yeah, those are all good points.
Yeah, like in a perfect world for me, honestly, I would rather have too many proposals than too few. And so, because you can weed through them like pretty quickly, or just not meet quorum on some of the garbage ones, and it's better to get that ideation rather than like making people like work for it more. If that makes sense.
I sort of disagree there, because I had this conversation with Mariano from MakerDAO, and his opinion was that their governance system didn't work as well currently because they had too many proposals at one given time. So I think there's a good middle road there, but I overall agree that the deposit for starting a poll should be returned if a poll at least passes or reaches quorum. I think the conditions there can still be part of a discussion. The reason why I think it's not implemented currently is because we decided to go with like a very lightweight polling system, and having that return functionality and stuff like that would of course increase the gas cost of the voting contract itself in its current status.
Even if there was just some way to subsidize it or something lo-fi, just anything to reduce friction is probably a good idea.
Yeah, but also I don't think we need to take any action on it immediately, just because it's like you know, if live here was worth $10 and this was like $1,000, like that would really suck. But it's, I don't know what the price is right now, but it's like not crazy. And so if it's like under 250, it's like not ideal, but you're like, all right, you know, it's fine. So yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Go for it, Gavin.
I was just going to say, but like we should almost be paying people to do the work that like Victor did. So,
Yeah. No, I agreed.
so
Yeah.
like it's not even just a matter of it being like a cost to participate, but there's like I'd almost rather be going the other way. So like it would be nice if there's okay, I understand we need some way to prevent spam, spam proposals and that sort of thing. But can you even launch a proposal if it's not in GitHub? Like if it's not accepted as an LIP?
In theory, you can if you interact with the contracts directly,
Right.
but like the application doesn't support that.
Okay. So I get that you don't want spam, but like probably, especially at the beginning, it would be nice if there was something configurable so that initially you could have like encourage proposal creation, and then later, if you start running into spam issues, then make a proposal to kind of make some sort of friction.
Well, in terms of subsidizing, at least, the only time it needs to be subsidized is when a proposal is moved to a poll, right? So that means there has already been an LIP process for a proposal before that. I'll be currently on GitHub. So from that perspective, one could, of course, create a Gitcoin grant and look for an implementer or look for like a champion for that proposal, as well as the necessary funds to move that to a poll. So that's one option, of course.
That's a great idea.
I mean, it's similar to like most Ethereum IPs, right? Let's take EIP 15059, for example. Like it's been discussed for a while now, and like the implementers have actually been found on Gitcoin because there's a quite substantial Gitcoin grant out for it. So yeah, we could always use that. It's quite mature now.
Cool. Yeah, I think there were a lot of good ideas expressed here, and I feel like the general theme seems to me to be that, well, we started off talking about the requirement of an implementation at a stage in the LIP process, and then we got to this topic because we were talking about one way to require an implementation is to have like two separate voting periods, so you can vote on the ideas and then vote on the implementation. But there are some challenges presented with the current way our voting system works. And I think there's definitely a design space to be explored there. So yeah, maybe because we're reaching the end of the call, we can take as a to-do. I don't know if anyone on this call is in particular interested in this topic, but this could be a good candidate for a proposal to modify our current voting system. So yeah, if anyone is interested in doing that and wants support, definitely like share with the group or share on GitHub and Discord, and then we can figure out how to best move forward with a proposal to change how the voting system works. That's more welcoming to people that put in a lot of effort like Victor. Cool. All right, so we have 2 minutes left in the call. I feel like that was basically an extension into the open discussion period. But with the remaining 2 minutes, does anyone have anything that they want to bring up with this group before we wrap up?
Not for me, but I did want to say thank you. This was my first governance proposal, and so it's been lovely to go through it with you guys.
Sure. Thanks for putting in the work. All right. Thanks everyone for joining the call. The notes and recording will be available sometime soon. And then I will see everyone on the next call in 2 weeks. See you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
See you guys.